The Land of Golden Things. Once upon a time, there was a king who was very poor. He hadn't even a palace to live in, and that made him very sad. He had a crown to wear, it's true, but it wasn't made of real gold, and it only had 8 precious stones in it. He lived alone in a cottage with his little daughter, Rosamunda. He'd spent all of his money in going to war with another country, and had lost the battle. His people were too poor to help him, so there he was, a king no better than a pauper. His cottage was built in a lovely place, looking out over the blue sea. He had 1 cow that gave him creamy white milk, 4 hens that laid him eggs every day, and an old servant woman who cooked him nice, simple meals, grew fine vegetables in the little garden, and looked after Rosamunda. The king was very unhappy. He longed for a palace, he longed for a treasure chest filled with gold, he longed for hundreds of servants, fine clothes and beautiful furniture. His little daughter grieved to see him so miserable, and tried to make him laugh and smile, but it was very difficult. Rosamunda was happy. She knew she was a princess, but she was glad she didn't live in a palace. She liked to feed the 4 hens and milk the gentle cow. She loved to paddle in the warm pools and walk out on the windy hills. Best of all, she liked to work in a little garden that belonged to the cottage. She loved to grow bright flowers and pick them for the jugs and bowls indoors. She used to take big bunches of sweet-smelling roses to her father and make him look at how lovely they were. "Look, Daddy," she would say, "smell them. Aren't they beautiful?" But the king wouldn't bother about them. If they'd been made of silver or gold, he would have seized them eagerly, but they weren't. One day in the summertime, he had a birthday. Rosamunda planned to give him a lovely present. She had a little rose tree in a pot, one that she'd grown all by herself, and she meant to give her father this. She gave him a birthday hug, and then suddenly brought out the dear little tree. It was covered with tiny pink buds and blossoms, and was just like a fairy tale tree. Rosamunda felt sure her father would love it. But do you know, he didn't even look at it properly. He just glanced at it and said, "Thank you, my dear," and nothing else at all. He didn't say, "Oh, what a lovely little tree. How shall I love to have it and look after it?" Rosamunda was dreadfully disappointed. "Daddy, darling, you must be sure to water it every single morning before the sun gets hot," she said to him. "It's rather a delicate little tree, so please see that it gets enough to drink." The king put it on the windowsill in his tiny bedroom and then forgot all about it. He sat down and thought of all the birthdays he would have had if he had been a king with lots of money in a rich kingdom. "I should have had 100 guns fired off," he thought. "Then people would have come to my throne bringing gorgeous presents. At night I would have given a grand party and had kings and queens, princes and nobles for my guests. Wouldn't it have been fine?" He made himself so miserable, grieving over this, that for quite a week he forgot to smile at Rosamunda. She was sad because she loved him. She felt sure, too, that he had forgotten to water the little tree she'd given him. One bright morning, the king went for a walk through the fields that lay behind his cottage. As he went on his way, a stranger approached him. He was a fine-looking youth, tall and strong. "Can I help you?" asked the king, seeing that the stranger seemed to have lost his way. "That would be kind of you," said the youth. "I want to get back to the place where I've left my carriage, and I cannot find the way. It was by a lovely little blue stream that ran through a wood." "You've wandered for miles, then," said the king. "I know the stream. Let me take you back myself. I'm sorry I have no servant to guide you, but there's only the old woman in the cottage. I am a king, but I have none of the things a king should have, as you can see, except for my crown." "That is very good of you," said the stranger. So he and the king walked over the fields together, and after about 2 hours came to where the carriage had been left. How the king stared when he saw it! It was made of pure gold, and shone in the sun so brightly that the king was dazzled when he looked at it. There was a coachman there, clad in golden livery, and 8 footmen, all in gold breeches and coats of fine brocade. "How rich you must be!" the king said enviously. "Let me drive you to my kingdom, and you shall see it," said the strange youth. "It's supposed to be one of the most wonderful places in the world." The king stepped into the carriage. The coachman flicked his golden whip, and the horses started forward. How fast they went! The king knew they must have some sort of magic in their blood, for they went too fast for him to see anything out of the windows at all. Trees, houses and hedges flashed by in a long line. At last the carriage stopped in front of a vast golden palace. The king shut his eyes after giving it one glance, for it was so dazzling. He went up the golden steps, feeling quite dazed. The stranger gave him a wonderful meal served on golden plates with an edging of diamonds. He drank from a golden goblet studded with red rubies and green emeralds. Servants clad in rich golden draperies stood in dozens around the golden hall. How the king envied all of this richness! "If only I had a little of your marvellous store of gold," he said to the stranger, "how happy I should be!" "You shall have as much as my carriage will hold when it takes you home again," said the youth. "I have so much that I'm glad to get rid of some of it." After the meal, the king went to see the treasure house. There were not only bags of gold there, and chests filled to the brim with golden bars, but also rare treasures. There was a golden apple that could make anyone who was ill feel better at once merely by holding it in his hand. There was a goblet set with sapphires that was always full of the rarest wine in the world, no matter how much was drunk from it. The king looked at all these things longingly. Then he saw a beautiful mirror, and he picked it up to look at it. "That mirror will show you the picture of anyone you think of," said the stranger. "Think of someone now, and take a look at the mirror." The king at once thought of one of his generals, and looked into the mirror. A picture came there, and he saw an old bent man working in a potato field. When the man stood up, the king saw that it was his old general. "Dear, dear," he said sadly, "to think my famous old general should be working in a potato field." Then he thought of the king who had defeated him, and immediately a new picture came into the mirror. It showed a fat, ugly man sitting at a well-laden table. He wore a heavy crown, and he frowned at his queen, who was sitting beside him. She was speaking sharply to him, and though the king could not hear what was being said, he knew that she was cross with his old enemy and was scolding him. "Ha!" he said. "So my foe has grown fat, and his queen leads a miserable life." Then he turned to the youth. "This is a marvellous mirror," he said. "May I have it? For it would pass away many a weary hour for me." "What will you give me for it?" asked the youth. "It's a very valuable thing." "I have so little I can give," said the king. "Would you like a cow, or a hen, perhaps?" The youth laughed. "No," he said. "You shall give me whatever you see first tomorrow morning. As soon as you set eyes on it, it will vanish away to my kingdom. It will be amusing to see what comes." The king took away the mirror happily. He saw many bags of gold stored away in the carriage that was to take him back to his cottage, and on his way home he made all kinds of plans. "I shall build myself a fine house," he decided, "and get a new crown. Rosamunda shall have a fur silken dress and a golden necklace." It was late when he arrived back at the cottage. The footman helped to dump all the bags of gold under the tree in a little garden, and then off went the golden carriage into the night. The king was tired. He undressed and got into bed, thinking of the wonderful mirror. "I shall look at the little rose tree that Rosamunda gave me for my birthday," he thought. "That should be the very first thing I set eyes on. It's about the only nice thing in this bedroom. I'm sure the stranger will be pleased to see it arriving in his kingdom." He fell asleep. When the early morning sun streamed into his room, he still slept, but Rosamunda was awake. She was out in the garden singing merrily. She looked up at her father's bedroom and wondered if he was awake. She caught sight of the little rose tree on his windowsill, and she saw that it was drooping. "Poor little tree, it wants water," she said. "I'll creep into Daddy's room and water it before the sun gets hot." She took a jug, filled it with water, and went up to her father's room. She knocked and then knocked again. When she got no answer, she opened the door and peeped in. She saw the king lying fast asleep in bed, so she ran lightly across the floor to the window and began to water the rose tree. At that moment the king awoke. He remembered that he meant to look at the tree first of all, so he opened his eyes and glanced across the window to where the tree stood. But Rosamunda stood there in front of it, watering it. The king saw her immediately, and then she vanished before his eyes. "Oh!" said the king in horror. He sat up and rubbed his eyes, and then he looked again. There stood the little tree, and there on the floor lay the jug that his little daughter had been using. But Rosamunda was quite gone. "She's vanished to the land of golden things," groaned the king. "Oh, what shall I do?" He got up and went to the window. Then he saw all the bags of gold lying under the tree in the garden, and in delight he rubbed his hands and laughed. He forgot all about Rosamunda, and dressed quickly in order to go and run his hands through the golden coins. He thought no more of his little girl all that day, till the old servant came to him in distress and said she couldn't find Rosamunda anywhere. And then the king remembered what had happened and told the servant about it. Oh, she sobbed, wringing her hands. "To think of my little pet all alone in a strange land. Oh, you wicked man, to forget all about your little lamb like this. What is gold compared with Rosamunda's silken hair, merry eyes and loving smile?" The king suddenly felt miserable. How could he have forgotten his happy little daughter? He went red with shame and turned away his head. But how could he get Rosamunda back? He didn't know the way to the land of the golden things. All that week the king missed his little daughter badly. He could remember Rosamunda's sweet smile and her loving voice. He could remember the feel of her warm hugs and kisses. He longed to hear the patter of her little feet. But instead of Rosamunda in the garden, he had bags and bags of gold. Then he remembered the wonderful mirror he'd brought back with him, and he looked into it. He thought of Rosamunda, and immediately the mirror showed him a picture of her. She was standing in a garden, picking roses from a glittering bush. But alas for Rosamunda, the roses were golden and had no smell, no softness, and no beauty. The king watched his little daughter in the mirror. He saw big tears streaming down her cheek as she held the hard rose in her hand. He knew how much she must miss her own little cottage garden, with its pretty, sweet-smelling flowers growing everywhere from seeds she herself had planted. "Oh, if only I could get my little daughter back again, I would be happy here for the rest of my days," he said. "I would willingly give back this gold and this marvellous mirror if I could have Rosamunda in their place. I have been a foolish man, always pining for riches when beside me I had Rosamunda, worth more than 1,000 bags of gold. How hard she tried to please me, how sweet she was, and how she loved me." The unhappy king walked out into the fields and wept loudly. Suddenly he saw the bright stranger again, and he ran up to him eagerly. "Tell me about Rosamunda," he cried. "Is she wanting me? Is she sad?" "Very sad," said the stranger gravely. "Will you take her back in exchange for the gold and the mirror, O king?" "Willingly, willingly," cried the king with joy. "I am cured of my foolishness. I no longer wish for anything more than my little daughter. If I have her, I am richer than any king in the whole world." "She is in my carriage over there," said the stranger with a smile. The king turned and saw the golden carriage standing in a narrow lane nearby. He scrambled through the hedge, tearing his clothes terribly, but he didn't care one bit. There was Rosamunda looking out of the carriage. When she saw her father, she gave a shriek of delight, opened the door and fell into his arms. How they hugged and kissed one another, how they laughed and cried. They quite forgot about the stranger. By the time they remembered him, he was gone. Vanished too were the bags of gold, the mirror and the wonderful golden carriage. But the king laughed to see them gone. He had Rosamunda back, and that was all he cared about. "Daddy, you seem different," said Rosamunda. "I believe you love me after all. We'll be happy together now, won't we?" "We will," said the king. "You and I will work in the garden together, and go for walks together, and row on the sea together. Won't we be happy, Rosamunda?" "Throw your crown away, Daddy," cried the little girl. "Don't be a silly old king with no money and lots of frowns and sighs. Be a nice daddy and smile and laugh every day." She took the crown from the king's head and threw it into a nettle bed. The king looked horrified at first, but soon he laughed, and never again did he want to be rich, for he knew that was foolishness. Now he and Rosamunda were as happy as the day is long. As for the little rose tree she gave him for his birthday, they planted it out in the garden. It has climbed all over the cottage now, and if you happen to visit them in the summertime, you will really see how lovely it is.